They entered the ring and never came back. Boxing's tragedies and the fight for safety. The ultimate price. Understanding boxing's inherent dangers. Boxing is a sport built on controlled violence. Two athletes enter a ring with the explicit goal of striking each other, often attempting to render their opponent unconscious through accumulated head trauma. This fundamental reality that success in boxing can mean inflicting brain injury creates risks that no amount of regulation can entirely eliminate. Throughout boxing's modern history, fighters have died as a direct result of injuries sustained in the ring. These deaths are not anomalies or freak accidents. They are the tragic but predictable outcome of a sport where powerful, trained athletes repeatedly strike each other's heads. Understanding this context is essential before examining specific cases, because it frames the ongoing tension between boxing's existence as a sport and society's responsibility to protect athletes. The medical reality is straightforward and sobering. When a punch lands on the head with sufficient force, the brain accelerates rapidly inside the skull, potentially causing contusions, bleeding, and swelling. Repeated head trauma, even when it doesn't cause immediate unconsciousness, accumulates damage. A fighter who absorbs punishment throughout a bout may be suffering progressive brain injury that isn't immediately apparent to observers, referees, or even the fighter themselves. The critical danger period often comes after the fight ends. Subdural hematomas, bleeding between the brain and skull, can develop gradually. A fighter may seem fine immediately after a bout, only to collapse minutes or hours later as bleeding increases intracranial pressure. Without immediate surgical intervention, such injuries are frequently fatal. This medical reality has been understood, at least in general terms, for decades. Yet boxing's culture, particularly in earlier eras, often prioritized toughness over safety. Fighters were expected to continue despite showing signs of distress. Corners were reluctant to stop fights, fearing their boxer would be labeled as quit. Referees, whilst tasked with protecting fighters, operated in an environment where stopping a fight too early drew criticism. The case of Johnny Owen exemplifies both the dangers of the sport and the failures of earlier safety protocols. Owen, a Welsh bantamweight known as the Matchstick Man due to his extremely thin frame, challenged Mexican champion Lupe Pintor for the WBC bantamweight title on 19th September 1980 at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. Owen was overmatched. Pintor was a devastating puncher who'd built his reputation on knockout power. Owen was a skilled boxer, but lacked the physical strength to withstand Pintor's assault. Throughout the fight, Owen absorbed tremendous punishment. His corner didn't stop the bout. The referee allowed it to continue. In the 12th round, Pintor landed a devastating combination that sent Owen to the canvas. Owen never regained consciousness. He was rushed to hospital, where doctors performed emergency brain surgery. He remained in a coma for 7 weeks before dying on 4 November 1980. He was 24 years old. The tragedy devastated the boxing community and raised serious questions about the sport's safety protocols, or lack thereof. Owen's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back through boxing's history. In the 1980s alone, multiple fighters died from ring injuries, each death prompting temporary soul-searching, followed by an eventual return to business as usual. The fundamental problem was systemic. Boxing lacked mandatory, comprehensive medical protocols that could identify fighters at risk and intervene before catastrophic injury occurred. The sport operated under frameworks that varied wildly by jurisdiction. Some athletic commissions required pre-fight medical examinations. Others had minimal oversight. Ringside medical personnel might or might not be present. Emergency equipment might or might not be immediately available. The decision to stop a fight rested primarily with referees who, however well-intentioned, lacked medical training to recognize subtle signs of neurological distress. This patchwork approach to safety reflected boxing's fragmented governance structure. Unlike major sports with centralized authorities, boxing operated and still operates under multiple sanctioning bodies, each with different rules and standards. A fighter deemed medically unfit to compete in one jurisdiction could simply travel to another with laxer requirements. The economic incentives also worked against safety. Promoters made money from fights that generated excitement, which often meant allowing damaged fighters to continue absorbing punishment. Television networks wanted dramatic finishes, not stoppages. Fighters themselves, particularly those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, needed purse money and were willing to take enormous risks to earn it. Johnny Owen's death, whilst tragic, did catalyze some improvements. The British Boxing Board of Control, which had licensed Owen, conducted investigations and implemented stricter medical requirements. But comprehensive reform would require additional tragedies and decades of advocacy before meaningful change occurred across the sport. The fundamental question raised by Owen's death and by every boxing fatality remains: can a sport built on inflicting head trauma ever be made truly safe? The answer, according to medical experts and boxing authorities who've grappled with this question, is no. Boxing cannot be made completely safe. But it can be made safer through rigorous protocols, mandatory medical oversight, and a cultural shift that prioritizes fighter welfare over entertainment value. The tragedies that followed Owen's death, stretching into the 21st century, would demonstrate both the progress made and the work still required. Each death would add to the body of knowledge about what fails and what protects. Each loss of life would, painfully and slowly, push boxing toward better practices. But progress measured in lives lost is progress purchased at an unbearable price. Modern tragedies, when safety protocols fail. The decades following Johnny Owen's death in 1980 saw significant improvements in boxing safety protocols across many jurisdictions. Medical examinations became more rigorous. Ringside doctors with specific training in neurological assessment became mandatory at major events. Emergency medical equipment had to be immediately available. Weight classes were more strictly enforced to prevent dangerous mismatches. Yet, despite these advances, fighters continued to die. 3 cases from recent British boxing history, Michael Norgrove in 2013, Scott Westgarth in 2018, and Sharif Lawal in 2024, demonstrate that improved protocols, whilst necessary, are not sufficient. Each tragedy reveals different failures in the system designed to protect fighters. Michael Norgrove was a 27-year-old light middleweight from Merton, South London. On 5 September 2013, he fought Tom Bowen at the Eltham Leisure Centre in what was meant to be a routine professional bout on the undercard of a larger event. Norgrove was relatively inexperienced, with a record of 4 wins and 15 losses, the profile of a journeyman fighter who provided experience for prospects but rarely won himself. The fight was stopped in the 10th and final round, with Bowen ahead on the scorecards. Norgrove had absorbed significant punishment throughout the bout, but there were no immediate signs of catastrophic injury. He returned to his dressing room, where he collapsed. Emergency services were called, and Norgrove was rushed to hospital. Despite emergency neurosurgery to relieve pressure on his brain, he died on 27 September 2013, nearly 3 weeks after the fight. The investigation that followed revealed troubling details. Questions were raised about whether Norgrove should have been cleared to fight, given his record of accumulated losses and the punishment he'd absorbed in previous bouts. The concept of wear and tear on a fighter, the cumulative effect of taking repeated headshots across multiple fights, became a central concern. Should athletic commissions track not just whether a fighter is medically fit on the day of a specific bout, but whether their career history suggests they've absorbed too much punishment overall? Norgrove's death prompted the British Boxing Board of Control to review its medical protocols and implement additional safeguards, including more rigorous assessment of fighters with extensive loss records. But 5 years later, another tragedy would demonstrate that gaps in the safety net remained. Scott Westgarth was a 31-year-old light heavyweight from Prudhoe, Northumberland. Unlike Norgrove, Westgarth was a successful fighter with a record of 10 wins and 2 losses. He was intelligent, articulate, and worked as a personal trainer outside the ring. On 24 February 2018, he fought Dex Spellman at the Metro Radio Arena in Newcastle in what proved to be a competitive back-and-forth battle. Westgarth won by split decision after 10 grueling rounds. In the immediate aftermath, he gave a post-fight interview, appearing coherent and celebrating his victory. Then he complained of feeling unwell and collapsed backstage. He was rushed to hospital, where doctors discovered severe brain bleeding. Despite emergency surgery, Westgarth died hours later. The tragedy was particularly shocking because Westgarth had won the fight and had seemed fine immediately after. The post-fight interview showed no obvious signs of distress, yet within minutes his condition deteriorated catastrophically. This highlighted a critical vulnerability in boxing safety protocols. Fighters can appear normal while suffering progressive brain injury that will prove fatal. Medical experts who reviewed the case noted that adrenaline and the body's stress response during a fight can mask symptoms of serious injury. A fighter may feel and appear fine whilst their brain is bleeding. By the time symptoms become apparent, often manifesting as sudden collapse, the injury has progressed to a point where intervention, even immediate surgical intervention, may not be sufficient. Westgarth's death led to renewed calls for mandatory post-fight brain scans for all fighters, particularly those who've absorbed significant punishment. But implementing such protocols faces practical and financial challenges. Brain scans are expensive and not always immediately available at boxing venues. The sport operates on tight budgets, particularly at the club and regional level where most professional fights occur. The most recent British tragedy occurred on 12 May 2024, when Sherif Lawal collapsed during his professional debut at the Harrow Leisure Centre in London. Lawal was 29 years old and had been boxing as an amateur for years before turning professional. His opponent in his debut was Portuguese fighter Malam Varela. The fight was stopped in the 4th round after Lawal was knocked down. According to witnesses and official reports, Lawal initially seemed stable after the referee's intervention. Then he collapsed in the ring. Despite immediate medical attention from ringside doctors and paramedics, and rapid transport to hospital, Lawal died later that day. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that it occurred during Lawal's first professional fight. He'd passed all required pre-fight medical examinations. He'd been cleared by doctors as fit to compete. There were no obvious red flags that should have prevented the bout from taking place, yet within hours of his debut, he was dead. Lawal's death prompted immediate responses from boxing authorities. The British Boxing Board of Control launched an investigation. Questions were raised about whether the medical response had been adequate, whether the referee had stopped the fight at the appropriate moment, and whether there were any systemic failures that contributed to the tragedy. Preliminary reports suggested that all required protocols had been followed. A ringside doctor was present. Emergency medical equipment was available. The referee acted within established guidelines for stopping a fight. Yet despite all these safeguards, a young man making his professional debut died in the ring. These 3 cases, Norgrove, Westgarth and Lawal, span more than a decade of British boxing. Each occurred under different circumstances. Norgrove was a journeyman who'd absorbed years of punishment. Westgarth was a successful fighter who appeared fine after winning. Lawal was a debutante with no professional history of accumulated damage. Yet all three died from brain injuries sustained in the ring, despite the presence of modern safety protocols. The common thread is that boxing, even with rigorous medical oversight, cannot predict or prevent every catastrophic outcome. Brain injuries are inherently unpredictable. Two fighters can absorb seemingly similar punishment with vastly different outcomes. One survives unharmed, another dies. The variables, punch placement, individual neurological vulnerability, genetic factors affecting brain injury susceptibility are too numerous and complex for any protocol to account for completely. This reality forces an uncomfortable reckoning with boxing's fundamental nature. If deaths can occur despite proper medical oversight, proper equipment, proper referee intervention, and proper post-fight care, then the deaths are not failures of protocol, but inevitable consequences of the sport itself. Lessons learned: how tragedy drives reform. Boxing's history of fatal injuries has, paradoxically, made the sport progressively safer. Each death, whilst tragic, has contributed to an evolving understanding of what protects fighters and what endangers them. The reforms implemented over decades represent lessons purchased at an unbearable price, but lessons nonetheless that have saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The transformation of boxing safety protocols from the 1980s to the present day is remarkable in scope. What was once a sport with minimal medical oversight and inconsistent standards has become, in well-regulated jurisdictions, a highly monitored activity with comprehensive safety requirements. Understanding this evolution requires examining the specific reforms that followed major tragedies. After Johnny Owen's death in 1980, the British Boxing Board of Control implemented several critical changes. Pre-fight medical examinations became more rigorous, requiring not just cursory physical checks, but detailed assessments of neurological function. Fighters were required to undergo regular brain scans to establish baseline measurements that could detect developing problems. The concept of medical suspension, preventing a fighter from competing for a specified period after certain types of injuries, was formalized and enforced more strictly. Perhaps most importantly, the board established clearer protocols for ringside medical intervention. Doctors were positioned at ringside with authority to stop fights if they observed signs of serious injury, regardless of what the referee decided. This created a safety net independent of the competitive aspects of the bout. Medical judgment, not sporting judgment, would determine when a fighter's health was at unacceptable risk. The Michael Norgrove case in 2013 prompted additional reforms focused on cumulative damage. The board implemented more stringent oversight of fighters with extensive loss records, recognizing that a pattern of defeats often correlates with absorbed punishment. Medical suspensions following losses became mandatory in many circumstances, preventing fighters from immediately returning to the ring after absorbing significant head trauma. A central registry system was enhanced to track fighters' medical histories across their entire careers. This prevented fighters from evading medical suspensions by simply licensing in different jurisdictions, a previous loophole that had allowed damaged fighters to continue competing when they should have been resting. The registry tracks knockouts, technical knockouts, and medical suspensions, creating a comprehensive picture of each fighter's accumulated risk. Scott Westgarth's death in 2018 highlighted the dangers of the immediate post-fight period. His collapse came after a post-fight interview, when medical attention had been reduced and the fighter was no longer being monitored as closely as during the bout itself. This tragedy prompted reforms requiring extended medical observation periods after fights, particularly for boxers who've absorbed significant punishment or been knocked down. Protocols were established mandating that fighters remain under medical supervision for at least 30 minutes after a bout ends. During this period, doctors conduct neurological assessments looking for delayed symptoms of brain injury. Fighters showing any signs of distress, headaches, nausea, confusion, balance problems, are immediately transported to hospital for imaging and observation. The requirement for immediate ambulance availability became universal in British boxing. Every sanctioned event must have an ambulance on site, positioned for immediate departure to a hospital with neurosurgical capability. The delays that contributed to earlier tragedies, when ambulances had to be summoned after a fighter collapsed, are no longer acceptable. The ambulance is there before the first punch is thrown. Sheriff Lawal's death in 2024, occurring during his professional debut, has prompted discussions about additional safeguards for fighters making the transition from amateur to professional boxing. The amateur rules, shorter rounds, more protective headgear in some competitions, different scoring systems create a different risk environment than professional boxing. Questions have been raised about whether a mandatory orientation period, perhaps requiring fighters to compete in shorter professional bouts before attempting standard distances, might reduce risks for debutants. Beyond British reforms, international boxing organisations have adopted increasingly stringent safety standards. The Association of Ringside Physicians, an international organisation of doctors specialising in combat sports medicine, has developed comprehensive guidelines that many jurisdictions have adopted. These include detailed protocols for pre-fight examinations, ringside medical equipment requirements, and post-fight care standards. Modern ringside medical requirements typically include oxygen and resuscitation equipment immediately available, intravenous fluids and medications to manage brain swelling, and communication equipment to coordinate with hospital emergency departments. The doctor must have specific training in recognizing neurological injuries and authority to override any other official's decision if fighter safety is at risk. Weight class enforcement has become more rigorous, reducing dangerous size mismatches. Fighters must weigh in on the day of the fight, not the day before, preventing extreme weight cutting that leaves fighters dehydrated and more vulnerable to brain injury. Same-day weigh-ins ensure fighters enter the ring at weights close to their natural body mass, with proper hydration that provides some protection against concussion. The number of rounds has been reduced in many circumstances. Championship fights were once scheduled for 15 rounds. Today, 12 rounds is standard for title bouts, with most non-championship fights limited to 10 rounds or fewer. This reduction decreases cumulative head trauma and reduces the likelihood that exhausted, defenseless fighters continue absorbing punishment in later rounds. These reforms have demonstrably reduced boxing fatality rates. Statistical analysis shows that deaths per 1,000 professional bouts have declined significantly since comprehensive safety protocols were implemented. The sport remains dangerous. Nothing can eliminate risk when the objective is to strike opponents' heads, but the improvements are measurable and meaningful. Yet every reform has come at a cost beyond financial implementation expenses. Each new protocol represents a tragedy that prompted its adoption. Johnny Owen's death drove pre-fight medical improvements. Michael Watson's near-fatal injuries in 1991 forced ambulance requirements. Michael Norgrove's death prompted cumulative damage tracking. Scott Westgarth's collapse led to extended post-fight monitoring. Sheriff Lawal's death continues to drive discussions about debut fighter protections. This is progress measured in lives lost, fighters who died so that protocols could be revised, standards enhanced, and future fighters better protected. Their names are attached to the reforms they inadvertently prompted, a permanent memorial of the price paid for incremental safety improvements. The ongoing fight, honoring legacy through continuous improvement. The reforms implemented following boxing tragedies represent significant progress, Yet the question remains, is boxing now safe enough? Or does the sport's fundamental nature mean that additional measures are both necessary and possible? Medical experts who study combat sports injuries are unanimous in their assessment. Boxing can be made safer, but it cannot be made safe. The distinction is critical. Every improvement in protocols, equipment, and medical oversight reduces risk, but cannot eliminate it. The sport's core activity, two athletes striking each other's heads with maximum force, creates inherent dangers that no amount of regulation can fully prevent. This reality places boxing in an uncomfortable ethical position. Society generally accepts that adults can consent to risky activities, from mountaineering to motor racing. But those sports don't have injury infliction as their primary objective. Boxing is unique in that success often requires causing neurological damage to an opponent. This creates moral questions that extend beyond mere risk assessment. Some medical organizations have called for boxing to be banned entirely. The British Medical Association, American Medical Association, and Australian Medical Association have all, at various points, advocated for prohibition based on the argument that deliberately inflicting head trauma cannot be ethically justified regardless of consent. These calls have consistently failed to gain political traction, largely because boxing remains popular and because prohibition would likely drive the sport underground, where safety standards would be even worse. Given that boxing will continue to exist in legal, regulated form, the relevant question becomes, what additional measures could further reduce fatalities and serious injuries? Several proposals have emerged from the medical community, some already implemented in certain jurisdictions, others remaining controversial or impractical. Mandatory post-fight brain imaging represents one such proposal. Currently, fighters receive brain scans before beginning their careers and periodically thereafter, establishing baseline measurements. But routine post-fight imaging, MRI or CT scans for every fighter after every bout, could detect developing hematomas before symptoms appear. Early detection would allow surgical intervention before bleeding becomes life-threatening. The challenges are primarily logistical and financial. Brain imaging equipment is expensive and not available at most boxing venues. Transporting fighters to hospitals for scans after every bout would be costly and time-consuming. For smaller shows featuring multiple fights, implementing universal post-fight imaging would be prohibitively expensive. Yet Sheriff Lawal's death, occurring during a collapse before brain bleeding could be detected, demonstrates the potential value of such measures. Reduced round limits represent another potential reform. If 12 rounds represents progress from 15, why not reduce further to 10, 8, or even fewer? Each round reduction decreases cumulative head trauma and reduces the likelihood that exhausted, vulnerable fighters continue absorbing punishment. Critics argue that this fundamentally changes the sport, but proponents note that boxing has evolved repeatedly throughout its history whilst retaining its essential character. Improved protective equipment faces resistance from boxing traditionalists, but merits consideration. Amateur boxing uses headgear, though evidence about its protective value is mixed. Some studies suggest headgear may actually increase concussion risk by adding weight to the head and creating a larger target. But other protective innovations, such as improved mouthguard designs that better stabilize the jaw and reduce brain movement, show promise. Technological monitoring systems could provide real-time data about accumulated head impacts during fights. Sensors embedded in gloves or headbands could measure force and frequency of strikes, allowing ringside doctors to make more informed decisions about when cumulative damage has reached dangerous levels. Some combat sports organizations have begun experimenting with such systems, though implementation in professional boxing remains years away. Perhaps the most important ongoing reform involves cultural change within the sport itself. Boxing has traditionally celebrated toughness, valorized fighters who absorb tremendous punishment and continue, and criticized corners for throwing in the towel to stop fights. This culture, whilst admirable in some respects, has contributed to fighters continuing when they should stop and corners hesitating to protect their boxers. Changing this culture requires redefining what constitutes courage and toughness. A corner that stops a fight to protect a damaged fighter should be praised for wisdom, not criticized for weakness. A referee who errs on the side of caution should be commended, not accused of ruining entertainment. The British Boxing Board of Control and other regulatory bodies have worked to shift these attitudes, but cultural change proceeds slowly. Education for fighters, trainers, and officials about brain injury risks and symptoms represents another critical ongoing effort. Many people involved in boxing, particularly at amateur and club level, lack detailed understanding of neurological injury mechanisms. Comprehensive education programs can help all participants recognize warning signs and understand why certain protocols exist. The families of fighters who've died in the ring have often become advocates for safety improvements, channeling their grief into efforts to protect others. Scott Westgarth's family established a foundation promoting boxing safety awareness. Michael Norgrove's death prompted his family to speak publicly about the need for better medical oversight. These families honor their loved ones. Memories not through revenge or bitterness, but through constructive advocacy for reform. This represents perhaps the most meaningful way to honor fighters lost to boxing's inherent dangers, ensuring their deaths contribute to protecting those who follow. Johnny Owen, Michael Norgrove, Scott Westgarth, Sheriff Lawal, and countless others who've died in rings across the world are remembered not just as victims of a dangerous sport, but as catalysts for change that has saved lives. Every fighter who survives a bout that might have been fatal under earlier protocols owes a debt to those who died when those protocols didn't exist. Every life saved by improved medical response, better equipment, or stricter oversight represents vindication of the reforms those tragedies prompted. The ongoing fight for safety in boxing is exactly that, ongoing. It doesn't end with current protocols, no matter how comprehensive they may seem. Medical understanding evolves, technology advances, new risks emerge as the sport changes. Maintaining and improving fighter safety requires constant vigilance, continued research, and willingness to implement reforms even when they're inconvenient or unpopular. Boxing will never be completely safe. The nature of the sport prevents that. But it can be safer tomorrow than it is today, just as it's safer today than it was yesterday. That progress, measured in lives saved and injuries prevented, represents the legacy of every fighter who entered the ring and never came back. They died pursuing their dreams, doing what they loved in a sport that meant everything to them. The least we can do, the very least, is ensure that their deaths meant something, that the reforms they prompted protect others, and that boxing continues evolving toward a future where tragedies like theirs become increasingly rare. Their names deserve to be remembered, their families deserve our respect, and their legacy deserves to be honored through continued commitment to fighter safety, not as an afterthought or inconvenience, but as the fundamental priority that should guide every decision made in this dangerous, beautiful, and deeply human sport.